Some bloodlines are eroded by war. Others are fractured by scandal. And then there are those that decay quietly, generation by generation, until the damage becomes irreversible. This is the story of one such lineage. A family shaped by isolation. By repetition. By a family tree that never learned how to branch. Deep within the fog-drowned hollows of eastern Kentucky, where the Appalachian Mountains curl in on themselves like a secret never meant to be spoken aloud, there once existed communities untouched by time. Places where progress stalled. Where roads ended. Where traditions hardened into law. It was here, far from paved highways and modern hospitals, that a physician would stumble upon one of the most disturbing medical discoveries in American history. The winter was 1957, when Drive Thomas Harrington first recorded what would later be identified as a previously unknown genetic condition. His notes were clinical. Detached. But between the lines, unease lingered. Our story begins in Ellerslie County, Kentucky, one of the poorest regions in the nation during the mid-20th century. Coal mines were shutting down. Jobs vanished. Families who could leave, did. Those who couldn't, or wouldn't, retreated deeper into the mountains. Over time, entire communities folded inward, severed not just by geography, but by choice. Among them was the Shelton family. By 1957, the Sheltons had lived in the same narrow valley for more than 7 generations. Their land, nearly 200 acres of unforgiving woodland, sat trapped between steep ridgelines, natural walls that cut them off from neighboring towns. During harsh winters, snow buried the single dirt road leading out, sometimes isolating the family for weeks. 3 cabins stood clustered around a central clearing. Each connected. Each occupied by another branch of the same bloodline. When Dr. Harrington first arrived, he sensed something was wrong before he ever stepped inside. The similarities were immediate, he later wrote in his medical journal. Not merely familial resemblance, but repetition. Abnormalities recurring with unsettling consistency. The family patriarch, Elijah Shelton, was 79 years old. In 1895, he had married his first cousin, Sarah. Their children would go on to marry mostly within the family, or into 2 neighboring clans, the Rosses and the Bennets, families they had intermarried with for generations. By the 1950s, the lineage had collapsed into a genetic knot. Children in the youngest generation were not simply cousins. Many were simultaneously second cousins, and aunts, and uncles, to their own siblings. Dr. Harrington had been summoned after local authorities received a troubling report from a traveling Bible salesman. He claimed to have encountered children with severe deformities, conditions so pronounced that they haunted him long after he left the valley. What the doctor found would eventually become one of the earliest modern American case studies on the consequences of prolonged consanguinity. The youngest Sheltons displayed a constellation of symptoms that went beyond coincidence. Distinct facial abnormalities. Eyes spaced unnaturally wide. Small, misshapen skulls. Malformed jaws that affected speech and feeding. Cognitive impairments varied in severity. Some children struggled mildly. Others never learned to speak. But the most alarming condition was neurological. A progressive disorder that began with faint tremors in childhood. By adolescence, motor control deteriorated. By early adulthood, many could no longer care for themselves. Inside the main cabin, Dr. Harrington examined Miriam Shelton, 32 years old. Her hands shook violently even at rest. Speech came slowly, slurred, as though each word had to fight its way out. According to her family, the decline had begun in her mid-20s. She has worsened steadily, Harrington recorded. 2 of her brothers show similar symptoms, though less advanced. Yet it was the children who disturbed him most. 19 minors lived on the property. 14 already showed signs of developmental delay, physical abnormalities, or early neurological deterioration. 5 had died in infancy. Congenital heart defects. Respiratory failure. Conditions rarely seen at such frequency. Then there was Emmett Shelton. 9 years old. Despite never leaving the valley in his life, his symptoms resembled advanced radiation exposure, hair loss, skin lesions, immune dysfunction. But no environmental cause could explain it. This was genetic. The Shelton family's isolation wasn't merely physical. As Harrington dug deeper, he uncovered a deeply ingrained distrust of outsiders, passed down like scripture. Elijah's grandfather had fought for the Confederacy. After the Civil War, he retreated into the mountains, convinced the government would one day seize their land. That fear became doctrine. They believe the outside world intends them harm, Harrington noted. And in protecting themselves from imagined threats, they have inflicted real harm upon their own blood. What made the Shelton case extraordinary wasn't just the severity of the conditions, but the emergence of something entirely new. A syndrome that did not yet exist in medical textbooks. As winter tightened its grip, Harrington returned again and again, slowly earning the family's trust. He gathered data, took measurements, recorded patterns. His findings would eventually be published in obscure medical journals, largely ignored for decades. Until modern genetics rediscovered them. As 1957 bled into 1958, Harrington presented his preliminary findings to colleagues at the University of Kentucky Medical Center. The reaction was cold. His presentation, Consanguinity and Novel Genetic Disorders in Isolated Appalachian Communities, was met with skepticism. Discomfort. Familial intermarriage was a taboo subject. Many physicians preferred safer explanations: malnutrition, poverty, environmental exposure. But Harrington refused to abandon the evidence. He invited Dr. Eleanor Wainwright, a geneticist from Johns Hopkins University, to examine the family firsthand. She had seen this before, in isolated European villages. And when she visited the Shelton compound in June of 1958, she immediately recognized the pattern. What we're witnessing, she later wrote, is genetic load magnification. When closely related individuals reproduce, recessive genes, normally dormant, have a much higher chance of expression. Over generations, those hidden flaws compound, multiply, amplify. In the Sheltons, this process had been unfolding for nearly a century. Dr. Wainwright's assessment left little room for doubt. The Shelton family carried multiple recessive genes, traits that, in a diverse population, would have remained buried. But here, in this closed genetic loop, they had surfaced again and again, compounding with every generation. Most alarming was the neurological condition. A slow, relentless unraveling of the nervous system. By her estimate, nearly 60% of adult family members showed signs of it. A disorder that began quietly, almost politely. A tremor in the hands. A slight instability when walking. A hesitation in speech. Then came the losses. Motor control faded. Cognitive decline followed. Complications stacked upon complications. And eventually, death. Dr. Wainwright identified the inheritance pattern as autosomal recessive. A condition that requires both parents to carry and pass on the same flawed gene. In the general population, this is rare. In the Shelton family, it was almost inevitable. I reviewed the family Bible, she noted. Births. Deaths. Marginal notes going back to 1815. The turning point appeared around 1880. That was when the family's isolation deepened. Infant mortality doubled. Mentions of what they called the shaking sickness appeared by 1910. By the 1950s, it had become common. Endemic. The Sheltons weren't alone in their isolation. Economic forces had tightened the valley's grip as well. After World War II, coal mining declined sharply across eastern Kentucky. Young people left for Detroit, Cincinnati, Chicago. But families like the Sheltons stayed behind. Limited education. Visible physical differences. A lifetime spent apart from outsiders. Each factor narrowed the gene pool further. In July of 1958, tragedy struck again. Miriam Shelton, the woman Harrington had examined months earlier, died after choking during a violent tremor episode. She was 32 years old. Her death changed everything. With Elijah Shelton's reluctant permission, Harrington arranged for 2 children to be evaluated at the University of Kentucky Medical Center. Timothy and Ruth Shelton. Cousins. Ages 7 and 8. When they arrived in Lexington, their presence caused an immediate stir. Medical staff noticed the same facial patterns Harrington had described. Developmental delays. Early neurological symptoms. Blood samples were taken. Brain activity was measured using electroencephalography, still a relatively new technology at the time. The results stunned the neurologists. "I've never seen electrical patterns like this," reported Dr. Franklin Pierce. "This isn't a simple developmental disorder. Signal transmission itself appears altered." The children remained at the medical center for 3 weeks. During that time, doctors and students came to observe them, sometimes out of curiosity rather than care. What would later be recognized as ethical violations were, at the time, routine. Back in the mountain hollow, tension grew. Some family members resented the attention. Others began asking questions they had never allowed themselves to consider. One voice stood out. Joseph Shelton. 22 years old. Elijah's grandson. Recently returned from a brief military service, Joseph had seen the world beyond the ridges. Cities. Strangers. Hospitals that didn't fear outsiders. His own tremors had begun to surface. Quietly. Intermittently. He spoke openly with Harrington. "Grandpa always told us outsiders brought sickness," Joseph said. "But I've seen enough now to wonder if we got it backwards." That realization split the family. The older generation clung to tradition. Blood purity was protection. Outsiders were decay. The younger adults looked at their children and began to doubt. By the fall of 1958, Dr. Wainwright completed her formal report. Her conclusions were direct. Unforgiving. The intermarriage had to stop. Continued consanguinity would intensify symptoms, accelerate onset, and likely introduce additional genetic disorders. "The neurological condition I've termed Shelton's neurological deterioration appears progressive and terminal," she wrote. "There are no effective treatments." Neither physician anticipated what would follow. The winter of 1958 into 1959 was brutal. Snow buried the valley. Roads vanished beneath drifts. Harrington was unable to reach the compound for weeks. During that isolation, Joseph Shelton made his decision. In January 1959, during a brief thaw, he loaded 2 small children into his truck. Martha and John Shelton. Ages 6 and 4. Both showed clear signs of developmental delay. Early tremors. Speech difficulties. Joseph drove them down the mountain. Straight to the Boonville courthouse. He requested state intervention. "I love my family," Joseph told the judge. "But this is killing us. These kids deserve a chance." Judge Wilfred Davis hesitated. Rural Kentucky rarely interfered in family matters. Especially not ones bound by tradition and blood. But when Martha and John stood before him, small, shaking, visibly impaired, the decision became unavoidable. With Harrington's documentation in hand, Davis ordered the children placed in temporary state custody. News traveled fast. By the next morning, Elijah Shelton led a group of family members to Boonville. Armed. Rifles in hand. They demanded the children be returned. "This government has no right to steal our blood," Elijah reportedly shouted. "We've lived here longer than Kentucky's been a state." The confrontation nearly turned violent. Only the presence of law enforcement prevented bloodshed. A reporter from the Louisville Courier-Journal caught wind of the standoff. The headline ran days later, "Mountain Family Battle State, Ancient Ways Clash with Modern Medicine." The article described the family sympathetically, but detailed the physical abnormalities with clinical precision. It mentioned cousin marriages. That was enough. Public attention changed everything. Judge Davis upheld his ruling. Martha and John would remain wards of the state pending a full hearing. Dr. Wainwright returned to testify. "This is not neglect," she told the court. "These parents love their children. But love cannot override biology." She explained recessive inheritance, genetic concentration, preventable suffering. The March 1959 hearing became a quiet landmark. Martha and John remained in state care. For the first time in Kentucky history, genetic risk influenced a custody decision. Shockwaves rippled through Appalachia. Families who had quietly practiced intermarriage began reconsidering. Some didn't. For the Sheltons, the ruling shattered what remained of unity. Elijah and his eldest children retreated further inward, bitter and resentful. Joseph and a handful of younger relatives left the compound entirely. They resettled in Boonville. Sought education. Sought distance. By the summer of 1959, state health officials expanded their investigation. They found 7 other extended families with similar genetic patterns. Not just in Kentucky. West Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina. The problem was larger than anyone had admitted. Dr. Harrington continued documenting the progression of the neurological condition. Onset around age 8 to 10. Severe impairment by the late teens. Fatal complications by the mid-30s. Each generation suffered earlier. More severely. The symptoms are accelerating, Harrington wrote in 1960. What once appeared in adulthood now begins in childhood. For Martha and John Shelton, intervention came just in time. They were placed with a foster family in Lexington. Experimental treatments were attempted, rudimentary by modern standards. There was no cure. But there was hope. And for the first time in generations, the cycle had been interrupted. By the early 1960s, the Shelton family had become more than a medical curiosity. They were a case study. A warning. And for the rapidly evolving field of human genetics, something else entirely, a rare, uncontrolled experiment unfolding in real time. Joseph Shelton paid the price first. By late 1959, the tremors he once dismissed as nerves had grown impossible to ignore. His hand shook when he tried to write. His speech occasionally faltered. Simple tasks demanded concentration. Doctors confirmed what he already suspected. The same condition that had claimed Miriam was advancing through him. Yet Joseph refused to retreat. "I may not have long before the shakes take me for good," he told Dr. Harrington during an examination in April 1960. "But the sickness stops with me. I won't pass it on." True to his word, Joseph chose never to marry. Never to have children. For the first time in generations, a Shelton had consciously severed the bloodline. As Joseph declined, scientific interest intensified. In 1962, Dr. Eleanor Wainwright secured a grant from the National Institutes of Health to conduct a comprehensive genetic study of the extended Shelton kinship network, including the intermarried Ross and Bennett families. This was unprecedented. 67 individuals across 4 generations were examined. Blood samples were drawn. Medical histories reconstructed from fading memories and handwritten records. The isolation that had once doomed the family now made them invaluable to science. What makes this population unique, Wainwright wrote, is the relative consistency of environmental exposure across generations. No industrial pollution. No chemical runoff. No confounding variables. Just genes. The research team established a temporary field laboratory in Boonville. Over the course of 1962 and 1963, families traveled down from the mountains, some willingly, others reluctantly. Their findings were published in 1964 in the Journal of Medical Genetics. The title was clinical. The implications were not. The study identified 3 primary conditions concentrated within the Shelton lineage. First, the progressive neurological disorder affecting nearly 60% of adults. Second, a distinctive pattern of craniofacial abnormalities, small skulls, underdeveloped jaws, asymmetrical facial structure. Third, a congenital heart defect responsible for the family's devastating infant mortality rate. Most significantly, the researchers identified a previously undocumented autosomal recessive mutation. This mutation disrupted the production of a protein essential to neurotransmitter metabolism. Without it, neural signaling deteriorated over time. Motor control failed. Cognition slowed. The body betrayed itself. This is not an exaggeration of a known disorder, Wainwright explained. It is a new condition, amplified by generations of genetic isolation. The scientific community reacted cautiously. Some questioned the ethics of studying what they viewed as a social issue rather than a biological one. Others recognized the profound value of the data. Dr. Martin Schreiber of Harvard Medical School summarized the dilemma. "The circumstances are tragic," he wrote, "but the scientific insight is irreplaceable." By 1965, the effects of the 1959 court ruling were visible. No new consanguineous marriages had occurred within the Shelton network. The damage, however, had already been done. Joseph's condition worsened. By age 29, he required assistance with daily tasks. Seizures became frequent. Employment was impossible. Still, he remained an advocate, speaking with doctors, researchers, and younger relatives who had escaped the hollow. He understood the science better than many students, Harrington wrote. And he never once spoke of shame. In 1966, help arrived from an unexpected source. Researchers in Finland studying isolated rural populations identified a neurological condition with striking similarities to Shelton's deterioration. Protein structures matched. Mechanisms aligned. For the first time, the disorder had a biochemical fingerprint. That discovery changed everything. Martha and John Shelton, now 13 and 11, became early recipients of an experimental therapy based on synthetic protein replacement. It was crude. Imperfect. But it worked. Not a cure. A slowing. Martha's tremors have stabilized, reported Dr. Catherine Fleming, the pediatric neurologist overseeing their care. Her cognitive development continues, albeit delayed. John's progress was less dramatic, but measurable. Their case became a symbol. Hope, extracted from tragedy. In 1967, their story reached a national audience through a documentary titled The Hills Have Eyes, Medicine in Appalachia. The attention was double-edged. Funding increased. Outreach programs expanded. But stereotypes hardened. The implication of mutation. Otherness. Degeneracy. Regional advocates pushed back hard. Dr. Wainwright addressed the controversy directly in a letter to the New York Times. "This is not moral failure," she wrote. "It is biology under constraint." As roads improved and education expanded across Appalachia, isolation loosened its grip. Young people left the hollows married outside their families. Sought genetic counseling. For the Shelton descendants who integrated into broader society, the cycle ended. For Joseph Shelton, progress came too late. In December 1969, at age 33, he died from complications of his neurological condition. His obituary made no mention of genetics. Only courage. Only service. Only a quiet commitment to protecting children he would never raise himself. As the 1970s began, the Shelton story entered its final phase. Not collapse. Legacy. The original compound returned to wilderness. Cabins rotted. Clearings vanished. Beneath brush. But the science endured. The protein deficiency was officially named Shelton Wainwright syndrome, one of the earliest disorders named for both a patient family and a researcher. The methodologies developed during the study reshaped genetic research protocols. Multi-generational mapping. Ethical oversight. Informed consent. Medical ethics evolved because of what happened in that hollow. Dr. Harrington retired in 1978. In his final paper, he reflected on the transformation. "When I first encountered the Sheltons, their isolation was complete," he wrote. "Today, those barriers no longer exist. Follow-up studies confirmed what science predicted. The syndrome faded. The facial markers disappeared. Genetic diversity restored what isolation had destroyed. In 1985, the University of Kentucky Medical Center established the Joseph Shelton Memorial Fund for Genetic Research. Martha Shelton attended the dedication. Her speech was slow, tremor-marked, but her message was unmistakable. Joseph used to say knowing the truth might hurt, she told the audience. But not knowing hurts worse. She died in 1991 at age 38, nearly a decade longer than previous generations had survived. John passed away earlier, in 1980. But both lived long enough to prove something extraordinary. The cycle could be broken. By the early 1970s, the story of the Shelton family no longer belonged solely to the mountains. It lived in medical journals, in lecture halls, in the quiet conversations of genetic counselors explaining risks to anxious parents. What had once been dismissed as rumor or superstition had become established science. The hollow where the Sheltons once lived fell silent. Nature reclaimed what isolation had preserved. Roofs collapsed. Door frames rotted. The central clearing where generations had gathered dissolved back into forest. To the untrained eye, nothing remained. But absence can be misleading. The real remnants of the Shelton family lived on, in textbooks, in research protocols, and in the subtle ways modern medicine learned to speak about genetics with care rather than judgment. By the mid-1970s, public health initiatives across Appalachia began addressing isolation directly. New roads cut through ridgelines once considered impassable. Mobile clinics reached communities that had never seen a physician. Educational programs quietly dismantled the fear of outsiders that had once been passed down as survival wisdom. Genetic counseling, still in its infancy, became a bridge rather than a warning. Families learned that risk was not destiny. That inheritance could be understood. That cycles could be interrupted. Dr. Eleanor Wainwright reflected on the Shelton case during a 1975 interview. When we began, she said, families had no language for this. No options. No framework for understanding risk without shame. The Sheltons had lived without that knowledge. They paid for it with their bodies. Their suffering helped build an infrastructure that spared others. The ethical consequences of the 1959 custody intervention continued to echo. The decision to remove Martha and John Shelton from their family challenged long-standing assumptions about autonomy and state authority. Was it protection or intrusion? At the time, there were no clear answers. But the case reshaped how courts weighed medical evidence, especially when genetic harm was predictable rather than immediate. Modern child welfare law still carries its fingerprints. By the late 1970s, follow-up studies confirmed what earlier research had suggested. Shelton-Wainwright syndrome had nearly vanished from eastern Kentucky. Cases appeared only sporadically, almost always linked to families with historical ties to the original kindred. The distinctive facial traits faded. Infant mortality rates dropped. The tremors that once marked entire bloodlines became medical anomalies. Isolation had been the catalyst. Connection became the cure. Dr. Harrington, who had first stepped into the Shelton clearing during the winter of 1957, spent his retirement reflecting on the transformation. When roads came in, he wrote in his final paper, Genetic Diversity Followed. He noted how quickly change occurred once information flowed freely. What generations of secrecy had preserved, openness dismantled in less than 20 years. Joseph Shelton's choice, once viewed by his family as betrayal, became central to the story's legacy. By challenging tradition, he forced a reckoning that saved lives he would never know. In 1985, the Joseph Shelton Memorial Fund for Genetic Research formally expanded its scope. Grants supported rural outreach programs, rare disease studies, and training for physicians serving isolated populations. The fund remains active. Quiet. Purpose-driven. Martha Shelton's presence at its dedication was symbolic. She stood not as a victim, but as evidence. That intervention mattered. That science could bend the arc of suffering. That knowledge, even when painful, could heal. Her words that day were simple. "Truth hurts," she said. "But it also frees." The Shelton story is often framed as a cautionary tale. And it is. A warning about what happens when isolation becomes identity. When tradition hardens into law. When fear replaces curiosity. But it is also a testament to resilience, to learning, and to the cost of breaking silence. Their suffering was never meaningless. It forced medicine to confront uncomfortable truths. It reshaped ethics. It redefined how genetic risk is understood in vulnerable communities. Today, Appalachia is no longer the closed world it once was. Satellite dishes rise from ridgelines. Internet cables snake through valleys that once knew only word of mouth. Young people leave and return by choice, not necessity. Yet the mountains still remember. Stories linger in the fog. Not as warnings meant to frighten, but as lessons meant to endure. The Shelton family's legacy is not found in their bones, or their abandoned land. It lives in every child spared from preventable suffering. In every family given information instead of superstition. In every doctor who approaches genetics with humility rather than judgment. If you've stayed with this story until the end, then you understand something important. These aren't just histories. They are mirrors. They reflect what happens when knowledge is withheld, and what becomes possible when it is finally shared. If you value deeply researched investigations into America's hidden past, consider subscribing to the channel. Leave a comment letting us know you made it all the way through. And share this story, not for shock, but so its lessons are not forgotten. Because in the quiet hollows of Appalachia, and in isolated places around the world, the line between tradition and harm can be dangerously thin. And sometimes, the bravest act is simply choosing to know.